I have always wanted to get to a certain level, not for fame, notoriety, or money. They are byproducts. I wanted to get there to show what's possible.
Syreeta Brown is an award-winning senior exec with more than 20 years of experience for brands like BT, Citigroup, where she looked after over 20,000 employees, and most recently served as a Group Chief People and Communications Officer at Virgin Money. She was the first female black CPO at a FTSE 250 UK Tier 1 bank. She's also the author of the book Bigger Than the Moon, A Parent's Journey with Autism.
But the best things I've achieved have started not from a place of knowing, I would use the word courage. I was quite a courageous little girl. And I think as I got older, that got a little bit eroded, because you learn life comes at you and you start hearing the word barriers, limitations, and whatever the label is, it's not just about being a black person. Many people have this challenge, especially if you go through a corporate career. You have to wear a lot of labels in a corporate career, a lot of titles. You are defined by what you do, not who you are. I think fear is the biggest thing. Our culture is one of avoiding risk, because we need to feel safe and secure. We get a modicum of success as the world defines it, and we think we've got to protect that. My bestie always says to me, God doesn't give you anything you can't handle. I'm like, Susan, I'm sick and tired of hearing you say that. Intentionality, it's not tested at the beginning. It's tested in the process, in the most difficult of scenarios.
Did you realize the weight of the title that you were stepping into at that point in time, or was it just, this is me doing?
It was
With all those different accolades, how do you introduce yourself to people?
It's really interesting hearing all of that, because when you hear it, you don't realise how much you've done. I'm one of those people that just enjoys doing things, and I don't take time to think about what that looks like to other people. But recently I was asked to think about exactly that, and I discovered for myself the term joy seeker.
Ooh.
I am a joy seeker. I really look to find joy in all the things I do, even the hard, mundane things. And I discovered that leading people, leading teams is hard work. But if you can make it joyful, I think it's so rewarding for yourself and the team. So joy seeker is how I would describe myself.
I like that. Is there a difference between joy and happiness for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because I don't think when you go to seek joy, it might not always feel happy. Yeah. Joy is not a term that indicates eternal happiness. It's a process I think you go through to get there.
Yeah.
And and I think you only get to joy when you've gone through processing journeys, and they are tough. So I'm a realist. I'm not always happy, but I don't, I grew up in a Caribbean household, and my dad always had this, he had lots of sayings, as Jamaican fathers do, but his biggest one was nothing good comes easy. And so, I always carry that in my head when I think about the term joy.
I think it's so true. I think so many, and that's why I'm always interested to hear the people's understanding of that, because I always hear from the joy is internal and happiness is external.
Yes.
And then happiness can easily be taken away by
Absolutely.
my life, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But joy is the choice that you intentionally make.
Yes.
And to your point around even recognizing in the bad things, the pressures and those kind of moments, it's important for your growth and your development, and therefore you having a reframe is quite key. So you being a joy seeker, when I think about using that word and looking at all the things that you have done, massive accomplishments. I'm curious, if I wanted to really understand the true Syreeta, what's one story from your childhood that will be helpful to really know, that would give me a good example of who I see before me right now?
I had a lovely childhood, so many stories, but probably about kind of back end of last year, I, as you know, I was preparing to do a TEDx talk, and as part of that process, my lovely coach and friend now, Jessica Huey, she and I were talking, and we were talking about a scenario around when I first got on a bike, which I had never been on at all. And my mum, I was an only child for 9 years. I was very young at the time, and my mum took me to uh, uh, my friend's house, and her and her mum were talking, and the friend had a bike. And I was saying, I want to go on the bike. And my mum was like, no, Syreeta, you don't know how to ride a bike. And my mum said she just watched as I mounted this bike. And I just started to ride down this driveway, because they were in this kind of courtyard. Their house was in like a cul-de-sac courtyard. And she said she just saw me just get on this bike and start to ride. And it wasn't a perfect ride, but she said you just went for it. And, you got to the end and you didn't really know how to stop it, so you kind of fell off. But that is me, actually. And I think, and as I was recounting that story, I think that's just my approach to life. I may not know how to do things. I may feel challenged. But the best things I've achieved have started not from a place of knowing, of just, I would use the word courage. I was quite a courageous little girl and brave, and I just didn't see the limitation. And I think as I got older, that got a little bit eroded, because you learn life comes at you, and you start hearing the word barriers, limitations, but they never penetrated fully. I would recognize them, but I'd still keep going,
So with the love for, I want to say, people and transformation, where did all those different elements come from for you?
Yeah. It's a good question, because as I said, I was an only child for like 10 years, and in my household, and that's quite a solitary environment, right? I didn't have, a sibling in the house. I had friends, but I was very comfortable in my own company. But my parents introduced me to traveling very early. So I remember being on, I'm just going to tell my age now. I remember going to New York at 5 on a Laker Airlines plane. Yes, exactly. British Airways arch rival, and but it became an ally to Virgin as they were starting out. Okay. So Freddie Laker, and this was the days when you could smoke on planes. Yeah, and I remember it. So I can still recall it, actually, being on the seat and seeing all the smoke in the cabin. So my grandmother worked in New York, so my mum and I went to see her. That was my first experience of traveling. And then my whole childhood was littered with, we were quite fortunate that my parents just went with my uncle and his family. We would go to the States, we'd go to the Caribbean and have really long holidays. I went on long summer holidays and met so many different people. Some looked like me, some didn't. And I think my love of people grew from the interactions I had whilst traveling when I was younger, because I formed friendships, I formed, connections with people that you wouldn't normally do in the run of course of a day in the UK, right? And it opened me up to possibilities. So I think that's always been in me. And I think traveling is essential education for children.
Because it's that exposure to other people.
Yeah.
And it sounds very much like you were not a child where, even though you were only a child for 10 years, you were friendly. And going back to your words around boldness and confidence, you can go and talk to people and make new friends. And whereas you get some people who's like, I'm the only child, and they just kind of withdraw, and you sound like you're still quite outgoing and had that extrovert energy to go and kind of mix with other people.
I did. And I would say that I was an introvert extrovert. I've learned that term as I've got older, because if you meet me, you think, oh, she's really, outgoing. But I realized it takes a lot of energy for me to be that way. Because of that solitary foundation, and the bravery and the courage are the things that push me forward. But I have my moments where I need to just pull back, and I didn't recognize that until quite late, actually. In the last probably 5-6 years, I realized, oh my God, that's why I feel the way I do when I've been out on a social occasion, or why I might not relish the idea of going out with my friends to a party. It takes a lot of energy for me to do it. Once I'm there, I'm okay. But I like to decompress, yes.
Was there something that happened that made you pause and even ask yourself that question? What is it around going out to certain spaces that feels like an effort, feels like energy? Because like you said, it was 5 years ago. You've been doing this for a while, for a very long time, especially in the spaces that you operate in. So what was it that made you actually start to think about what's going on with me?
To be honest, I think identity is a really powerful thing. And for much of my life, I was the only person who looked like me in many environments. We grew up in a place called Wallington in Surrey. We were the first Black family there. Most of my school environments were all white. And that takes a lot of energy, actually. And I think I subconsciously took that into my teenage years and young adulthood years as well, because I, again, was in environments that there were not a lot of people that looked like me. I went into corporate as a graduate. I was always the only Black person in a room, often the only woman. And I didn't realise that woman was another thing I had to deal with until I got into my career, actually. It was always Black before that. And then I realised there was this thing called... I was like, oh, great. And then later on, as I had my daughter, I heard the word disability. It's hilarious, the labels it's only till you get the label you realise the conditions that you have to manage. And but as I said, this powering through, I powered through, as I think you do in the first half of your life. You kind of go, it's all about survival and progression and attainment. And then you start coming to the period of reflection, and you realize, oh my God, that's quite exhausting. It's quite exhausting always being on. And whatever the label is, it's not just about being a Black person. Many people have this challenge, I think, who, especially if you go through a corporate career, you have to wear a lot of labels in a corporate career, a lot of titles. You are defined by what you do, not who you are. And I think going through that realization has brought me to this period in my life now, where I am joyfully trying to return to who I am, because I've constantly been defined by what I do. And it's really exciting, actually. It's exciting. A friend of mine, Mel, and I have been talking about this, and this rediscovery process. I'm loving it. But I've always been naturally curious about learning anyway, so we could call it being a nerd.
It's not often I hear people use the word identity and excitement going hand in hand. A lot of the work I do involves identity, it's all identity in terms of transformation. And a lot of times it is senior leaders who are either dealing with pressure in those environments, or they've been like, I've been in the space for 30 plus years and I want to make a change or make a difference. But their identity has been one thing. And all those fears and insecurities come out like, but if I change, what are people going to say? How are they going to react? Or I used to get invites to that because I had this company name attached to me. Now look, I can see some people are starting to pull back. There's so many different things attached to the identity and the name of the space that operated in, that it can feel very scary and sometimes can hold them back. So to hear you say that, no, I'm curious and I'm excited about this. Like I would love to hear, how have you been able to get there and get to that space and face it the way that you're facing it right now?
Yeah, and look, I don't want to be disingenuous here. So the fear and the nervousness and the insecurity, I feel those things too. Okay, that's really important to acknowledge. But it's like the yin and yang philosophy. These things go hand in hand. I think sometimes people stay too much on one side. Yeah, they stay in the kind of fear category. Whereas I have intentionally tried to think about, okay, I do feel these things, but what's the opportunity? What's the other side? And I talk about this in my book, actually, in the journey with my daughter. You can be in the most awful situation, but you can think, well, what's the upside here? how can I make this a joyful, fearful experience, right? How can I embrace what it might be taking me to rather than what it's taking me from? So I think that ability to see things from all sides is really important. And that's where people like yourselves can help have a great role helping people through that process. I think because of who I am and what I've done professionally, I can do that self-instruction, but I still look for help in that. I still have a in HR, we say you must, when you're making transition, you should build a board of advisors, and I have a board of advisors. I don't do this stuff on my own at all. I'm very blessed to have worked with some amazing people from the very beginning of my career to now who I keep connected to. And they've been invaluable. Also staying grounded with your family, my poor mum and dad. I mean, I am the typical ring up your mum and dad child. I ring them up all the time, and I take a lot of guidance from them. And then definitely in the last kind of 12 years or so, the journey with my daughter has been, I would say, instrumental in allowing me to do a lot of this work with myself. So yeah, I've been fortunate.
How much of that journey with your daughter has shaped you professionally versus professionally shaping you to be able to deal or work with your daughter? I'm curious, which way did it
Oh
go?
God, it's a really good question. That's an amazing question. I think that my work helped me more to manage the personal situation.
Mm.
And then as I was managing the personal situation, I started to see the benefits on how that could shape me in my work. But it was that way around because it's a really, raising a child with autism, and not even raising a child with autism, going through that discovery process when you have a child who may have a special need and you are navigating lots of things is incredibly emotional. It's incredibly subjective. It's new territory, You're having to draw on things inside yourself that you didn't know you had. And I think without the professional capability that I had and the expertise, I'm not sure I would have been able to organize all of that in the way that I ended up doing it. So my work, working in corporate environments is equally traumatic sometimes, multiple things going on, lots of, as we call it, surround sound happening, lots of things that happen that you didn't plan for. And if you lead teams and organizations and functions, that too is an unknown sometimes. You can have the best laid plans can go off course. And you learn how to navigate that. You learn, okay, you know, project management. You learn, how am I going to execute this piece of work? How am I going to communicate to these stakeholders who don't understand me? How am I going to get this business case over the line? So all of those skills came in really handy as I found myself in this very emotional world of diagnosis and funding and local authority processes. I brought my work into that. It allowed me to be, right, who do I need to connect with here? Who are my allies going to be? How am I going to get people to listen to me? And how am I going to advocate for my daughter?
Mm.
So my professional world collided with my personal world in a very fortuitous way, I think. And then once I got into the driving seat, as a parent, I realized how working with Chloe, how invaluable that was for helping me work with people in my team. She taught me amazing things. The most important one was patience, and listening,
Mm.
and stepping back a bit. I was always a lean-in kind of leader up to this point. Um, and then I realized the power of stepping back and silence and pause and reflection and allowing people to kind of be who they were rather than what I thought they could be, and trying to engineer things. Anyone who is managing a child with autism knows you can't engineer anything. They are who they are, and they don't.
The routine and structure it turns into.
And they are unapologetic about it. And so it's a very humbling process. You're like, okay, I have to think about how I'm going to connect with this person, how I'm going to communicate with this person, how I'm going to motivate them, how I'm going to influence them, because they're very dogmatic individuals. Not everybody, a child on the spectrum is different, but a consistent theme is they kind of know what they want and they do what they do. And you have to draw on techniques that you don't learn in traditional parenting.
It's I would say that being a parent for me, being married and being a parent, have been two training grounds that have taught me so much about life. Listen to you talk about how the corporate environment prepared you in a way where actually what do I need to do?
Yeah.
And how do I apply project management skills and that kind of stuff. But even as an element, I think you briefly touched on, but even dealing with the council, like you said, once you've been in that space, you don't realize how much it takes. Like there's a lot of back and forth.
Yeah.
And they were very easily trying to railroad you and trying to steer you in one direction, and you have to be a massive advocate. It's very, very draining. And yet you still have this high stakes role. How did you manage to handle both those elements, especially in that period when you're at the start of your journey, and still be this high flying leader while still navigating the personal things at home? Because that is a lot to kind of carry out the weight at the same time.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. And I think if I had been conscious during this process, I probably might have not made it. But I think a lot of me was running on automatic at the time. And this is where I think work for me, and look, everyone's an individual, and I am very much talking about my experience. I want to be really clear about that. But work for me was a gift. It was a gift. It allowed me to have a bit of a break from that world. It's a bit of reprieve. I wasn't in it full time. I was around some parents who that was their job, 100% full-time carers, full-time parenting, full-time advocating. And that too is hard. If I didn't have work, I'm not sure I would have made it, to be honest. So I had this period in the day where I could become Syreeta without all of that. I relished working, loved it, because, and I was working at a lot of that time, I was working at City and I was working globally. I was able to travel, and it energized me and gave me, because I think what you need, to your question, what you need for that process is energy. Energy is so important, I'm really into kind of, ancient, Chinese philosophies around energy, and, things like, Tai Chi, and they teach you that energy is not this physical extrovert thing. It's this internal thing.
It's like flow.
It's flow. And if that gets blocked, that's when I think the collapse comes, the emotional, the resilience goes down. So work energized me, and then I took that and then breathed and went into the world of local authority battling, which I am in to this day. What was an equally important factor that I learned over time, and not at the beginning, is rest and pause. Because actually keeping going can be quite dangerous as well. And your body will stop you eventually. Through health, it will stop you. Sure. And I learned, actually, I don't want to have to wait for that. So I had outlets. I still like to travel. I realized exercise was important, but also just rest. My best friend, Susan, is a big advocate. She used to say she's a big advocate of sleep. And I used to laugh at her when she said sleep's really important. I'd be like, how do you nap? We'd go on holiday and she'd just be napping. And sleep is very important. And I realized actually that there is science around that, right? That sleep was very important. But I had to, as I said to you about joy seeking, I didn't learn that straight away. I had to go through some pretty hard events, you know, to realize, okay, I need to rest. You know.
I guess you have the wisdom to be able to listen
Yes.
to the signals that are being displayed before you. I think far too often we just, especially when you're in the goal, you're so used to being what a lot of people these days mistakenly, personally, I think mistakenly term high performance isn't high performance. They just see it as it's high performance because I am moving, I'm being busy.
Yes.
But I mean, you're being busy, you're not being productive.
Yeah.
If you're being productive, you can be high performance without actually expending all the hours in the day. But to your point is like, you have to be able to listen to those signals and recognize rest is important because that's the flow. It's both in and out. It's not just kind of one way.
Yeah.
But then I find it remarkable with you is you're in that space, you're learning, you're dealing with your daughter, you're dealing with traveling still, like I said, 4 different continents at that point in time when you went to Sydney. Yeah. And it's roughly towards the end of that, you then stepped into Virgin.
Yes.
Major role.
Yes.
First Black woman in that space. Did you realize the weight of the title that you were stepping into at that point in time, or was it just this is me doing?
It was a riding the bike thing, right? It was that scenario in Technicolor. So I was working very happily at City, and when the opportunity came to go to look at Virgin Money, there's a saying that I recalled in my kind of early days of my career. You know, remember when you started. And I remember as a graduate in BT looking at this role called the Group HR Director and thinking, I'm going to do that job. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to do. I've always got this ambition for myself. And it's been driven primarily because I never saw anyone like me at that level. That's been a big driver for me. Like, yeah, I want to do that. I'm going to see a Black woman in that position. And then you end up charting a career, and then you don't forget about it, but you don't really recall that, you know, you're just kind of going through the process. And then this job came and I thought, this is it, you know, this is my moment to do that job. And there's a good and not so good side about this. So the good side is the ambition, the vision being realized, the goal. And many of us are driven in that way. And then you get to these jobs and you realize, okay, this is what it's really about. You know, you take away the title, you take away all the kind of the status, and it's bloody hard work. I was working harder than I'd ever worked in my career, and I loved it. I love hard work. I'm a big hard work person, but it was a humbling process for me because. So I'm not saying I perfected the world of managing the special needs of my daughter, but I'd kind of become an expert at this point. So there was a rhythm there. So now I was in the new territory, was work, right? I was learning this new muscle of leadership, and lots of things happened when I joined Virgin Money. I say to people, it was 4 years. My time there was 4 years, but it was like 8 years in the normal cycle of the world calendar because I joined and the Ukraine war happened. So then we had, like, literally within 2 months of joining, right? Then we had the cost of living crisis. It was post-COVID, right? So we still were having the tail end of COVID challenges. We had 3 prime ministers in my first couple of years, right? We had fiscal surprises, and I'm working in a bank. I'm in a UK tier 1 bank, which means that my CEO and CFO are at the heart of all those discussions with the government because there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm having to be the accountable person in the bank to deal with all the people implications of that. Huge learning, huge volatility, and I forgot the who for a while because it was all about what I was doing, and it was wonderful. It was really good, but it was a great platform to come back to. I always think there's a famous Buddhist monk, Pema Chodron, and she says nothing goes away until it teaches you what you need to know. Yeah. And I realized, okay, so the first thing was my daughter, and I got this job, and it again threw back the question: who are you? And it threw back the question through the work I was doing, through the teams I led. I love working with my teams, and I built a really lovely team there. And I worked with people who this question kept coming back: who are you? And then, towards the end of my time there, we had a transaction where we got bought by Nationwide, and the question came out in big Technicolor: who are you? What do you want to do next? And that's where I am now, again, but from a professional side rather than a personal side. And so now my personal side is helping my professional side. And this is where the joy comes in, because I know it's bloody hard work, and it doesn't feel comfortable. And this is the other thing about happiness and joy. It doesn't feel comfortable, but I know it's leading me somewhere. So I'm just embracing where I am at the moment.
You're leaning in.
Yes.
And you're leaning in with, when I hear you say it doesn't feel comfortable, and I hear that you say about joy, but listen to what you shared so far, it's like, it doesn't feel comfortable, but you've already done the work.
Yes.
To the point where now, even when it doesn't feel steady, you are still good enough to be like, let me move forward.
Yeah, I've got the blueprint.
I've
got the blueprint.
I think far too many people, it's you don't do the work beforehand, and then you might arrive for whatever reason at the same scenario, and that's when it completely floors you.
Yeah.
And that's why it's super important, even on your journey, to be able to do the work, because you never know what life is going to throw at you. Because you're like, well, personally, I'm good. Professionally, I'm figuring it out. And having the yin and yang of both, being able to be like, okay, I might get to this point where professionally, this is great. Personally, this is happening, and I need to deal with that. Having both at the same time happens sometimes. Yeah. You don't want that.
My bestie always says to me, God doesn't give you anything you can't handle. I'm like, Susan, I'm sick and tired of hearing you say that to me. I'm done. I don't want to learn anything. But going back to that word identity, this is where I realized, after kind of putting the word black to the background for a while and becoming a woman, because when you get into a senior role in organizations, it's all about being a woman. Your colour almost starts to become, from a female perspective, your colour almost starts to become a little bit irrelevant, because there's this big gender thing, right? Like, you don't see many women, and so the word woman came back into my kind of sphere. But then, as I was working through this transition, the word being a black person came back in, because I think culturally, our history, especially from those in the kind of African diaspora, those who were kind of shifted from the continent into, different places like the Caribbean, I think our narrative is one of keeping going, actually, and is not one of rest and pause and reflection. I know my grandparents didn't get the chance to do that, right? My parents, they kind of introduced me to that idea for me, but not for themselves, right? They kept going to give me and my siblings the foundation that we needed. But I started to look around and think, oh my gosh, we never take the time to take time out. We think we have to keep going. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. I think there's a fear factor as well. 100%. I think fear is the biggest thing, our culture is one of avoiding risk, because we need to feel safe and secure. We get a modicum of success as the world defines it, and we think we've got to protect that. And what happens if we don't have that? Because I think there's a perceived protection there against the realities of being a black person in the world, right? There's a perceived cushion. But I've realized that that's an illusion, actually. I think we are entitled to be risk-oriented. We are entitled to rest. And that's where the liberation comes, actually, not in this fear of avoiding it. And I think I really encourage people who are like me and have a similar journey to say, don't be afraid, because you don't transform from a place of security. You just don't, And look, there's some people who don't want to transform. They're happy.
You think so?
Well, I think they've told themselves the story.
Yeah, that's a story. That's a story that they've kind of wrapped around.
That it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so I don't you know, I'm really, again, being a mother to a child with special need, I try not to be judgmental. I try to understand. I think it's really important to understand. I'm really curious about people who don't think the same way as me because of my daughter, because of Chloe. I'm much more curious. I'm like, okay, so, you know, why would somebody be right-wing extremist? You know, what's their story? Because everyone's got a story. And it's not to validate or justify, just to understand doesn't mean you agree.
Yeah.
You just understand.
Yeah.
And so, but I think there is more of us that need to step into that world of risk and, you know, the unknown. I talk about it in my book, actually. There's an amazing Jungian psychologist, Dr. Estes, and she talks about, you know, the closing door. One of her, she talks through stories and folklore. And, you know, a lot of us see closing doors, but we're not turning around to see the door that's opening. We're just focused on the door that might close, on what we know. And I think, you know, and not enough of us are comfortable being in that mid place where we don't know. We've got the door's not open, but we know the door's closing. That's risk.
Living in the liminal spaces.
That's risk. And so you start taking the word risk. Risk isn't a scary word. It's just it's an unknown thing. We learn about it in banking. I mean, the whole world of banking in the UK is about risk. But actually, you know, I worked with an amazing chief risk officer, and she opened my mind up to the fact that actually risk is an opportunity, you know? It's not the bad person coming into the room to tell you what you can't do. It's it's the person coming into the room to say, look, here's some things you need to think about. And then you make some decisions about it, you know, knowing the upside and the downside. And I think if we could get people thinking like that more, I think people would inch towards the open door and not focus on the closing one.
Yeah, I think it's, to your point, I want to think about who we are as people, generally speaking, before we get into the race and gender mix. It's a conditioning that comes into play. You mentioned earlier on where, as a child, you were very bold and courageous. And then along the way, some of that got sapped in by the environment you find yourself in. Not all of it, which is why the foundation was still there, secure, and you cannot be able to build back up. But I think so many of us go through life and we let the environment start to dictate who we are, what we are about, how we should show up, how we should not show up. And it's interesting, every single time I go back to COVID and the conversations having then, the amount of people that were forced to stop and start to ask themselves some critical questions, the amount of changes that people made, both personally and professionally, because there were no vices, there were no excuses. You were stuck at home.
Yep.
You had to confront some of those, I want to say never inner demons, inner thoughts that you've tried to subdue for so long. And that's what led to a lot of shifts and changes that people made until the world opened back up again. And then things kind of go back to normal. And I think that's where the fear comes from. And I think it's, to your point, it's a false sense of security because as we're seeing right now, nothing is secure. You don't have much control. So if that's the case, what would happen if you actually braver and more adventurous? And to your point, start reframing what risk actually looks like. Because is it risky to do absolutely nothing? Or is it risky to lean in and to trust yourself?
Yes.
Because we are very, very brilliant. We are very, very capable. And the more we start to lean into and recognize that who we've been made and blessed with and the gifts and talents that we have, we can do a lot.
Absolutely.
And it gives you that sense of joy and peace, even though it is risky.
Yeah.
I put those words together. I know it sounds like a juxtaposition, but risk and they go hand in hand.
They go hand in hand. And, you know, I think about my grandmother. She, you know, on the face of it, she was quite a stern, sometimes impersonal, cold individual. But I knew there was a soft centre. And one day after she died, I did some research and found the log of her arrival into the country, the ship log. So I went through ancestry.co.uk and did all of that. And it's amazing what you can find in these things. And it had her details on there. And I was like, oh my God, you know, so I blew it up. And in that discovery, I realized, and this is not an unusual thing with people in the Caribbean community, maybe the African one as well, is that her birthday was completely different to what we had all thought, right? Completely different. And I thought, gosh, there's a story here, right? And then I started to because there was a lot of challenges with my grandmother and how she had conducted her life and with her children, and I found that quite hard to process. And then I started to stand in her shoes, and I thought, that's just a pretty brave thing, this migration thing. Migration is a brave thing to do, to leave the security of what you know, get on a ship and transport yourself to a completely different environment with no understanding necessarily of what that's going to look and feel like, but with a vision. And I started to break down all those things that you need to create visions. That generation, everyone, I think sometimes we diminish what they actually did. They came over in Windrush and they came to work and for a better life. No, they had vision. They had goals, and I am the manifestation of that for my grandmother. Many of her grandchildren are. It wasn't an immediate, it's a return for me. It was, I'm laying a foundation for the future. You could have these people running organizations, because that's what it takes to run an organization. Once you get to a certain level, it's how am I going to create a vision that people are going to align with? What am I going to put in place in order for that to be achieved? And who am I going to bring in to help me do that? And that's what that generation did. And I think I really started to do a lot of reflection on my past and all people who'd gone before me to reframe the narrative. Because I think in the culture, we diminish it to this process of leaving one country and going to another and working really hard. No, it was a big deal. And now within the current environment where we talk about immigration in such a negative way, we're in danger, I think, of diminishing what people do when they move from one environment to another, what it takes to do that. And it's in you. It's in you. You can do that too. I think there's sometimes a disconnect between the stories of what happened 2 generations ago with where you are now. And I think it's really important to try and connect those stories because we're losing the thread a little bit.
And there's power in the stories.
Yes.
And what you said earlier on is the understanding
Yeah.
piece. As someone who, I was born in Nigeria and moved here when I was a teenager, 11, 12. And I know what that felt like as a kid. I know what that felt like from what I can see with my parents and everything else stuff that they've had to go through. And then, I think back to, like I said, the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and that time, that's a whole different ballgame of the amount of racism and the challenges that they've had to go through. And they overcame.
Yeah.
And yes, the system is far from perfect, we know it. But there's so much that we can learn from them, that we can take that resilience of what is overused, or we can take the resilience, or actually a better word, the risk approach that they had, the vision that they had of wanting to create better lives for ourselves, and ask ourselves that question: what does actually having a better life for me looks like?
Yes.
And that means I need to be willing to take a risk, like they did, in my new modern world context, as opposed to what theirs was. And there's a word used in Orient, which I wanted to ask you about: intentional. It's a word that is used a lot of times. People are like, yeah, you made me intentional. And I'm like, yes, but a lot of times what I see happens is you set out with an intention, pressure hits, whether that's professionally or personally, pressure hits. And then you go into autopilot mode, which is then rewarding or leaning into a behavior or mindset, which is the old way of operating. But because the pressure's hit, that's what's been activated. And when I was working out, I caused them the intention gap. It was like, you got intention here, you got fulfillment over here, and in the middle is a gap. And most intentions die in that gap because of the autopilot mode.
Yes.
I'm curious, from your experience, how have you been able to navigate that professionally to ensure that you kind of lean more into get into fulfillment, get into clarity, being able to deal with the roots, the wiring, the languages, all these different things that keep the intentions in that gap, and start to come out on the other side.
Yeah. You know, look, there's nothing like being in, there's this real kind of not anti-corporate movement, but this big thing about being in a corporate. I've noticed this dialogue, like, you can only be free if you're doing your own thing. And that might be true, but there's a huge amount of value in those corporate organizations. They are a microcosm of the world. You get a lot in a corporate organization. You get the world wrapped up in you can put your arms around it a bit more. And one of the things that I think is really important in terms of kind of intentionality and what I've learned in my career, intentionality is not, it's not tested at the beginning. It's tested in the process. It's the remember why you started thing. And it comes at you in the moment, again, nothing goes away until it teaches us what we need to know. In the most difficult of scenarios, I always say to people, intentions are tested in the difficult parts. And in my professional life, I have always wanted to get to a certain level, not for fame, notoriety or money. They are byproducts. I wanted to get there to show what's possible. That as a Black person, I can get to that level.
To you or to others?
To others. Okay. To others. Yeah, if it was about me, I'd be on a beach with a rucksack. I say this every time. Anyone who knows me knows this. I would not be fighting the fight for myself. I'd have checked out a long time ago. I stayed in it because of that, because it's incredibly hard work, right? And that was my intention. It was like, no, I need to stick in it because there's no one there that looks like me. And if people see me, they'll know it's possible too. That was my philosophy. And when I'm there, when I'm at that table, I'm going to do the work. And the work is not to ingratiate yourselves with your board, your CEO, your colleagues. It's to do the work. And sometimes that work is to challenge the status quo. And I think that, not many people understand the HR function until they go into it. They think it's this nice people thing, but they go in and they realize, oh my God, this is hard work. I've known a lot of business people who've stepped out and said, no, it's all right. This is too much hard work. But I have been around discussions where I've been able to influence systems, processes, policies, the thinking of the most senior leaders in the organization. I've been able to call out inequities. I've been able to highlight the things that need to change and ask questions for them to answer. And those are difficult moments, especially when you're the person in the room, the only person in the room that looks like you. And I think some people get to these levels and don't do that. They go into the protection zone. And it is about them and not about the intention. I think we all start off with this intention and we get to these situations and we think, I've got to protect my position. I never felt like that. I'm like, well, and again, I think it's the Jamaican in me, to be honest, but it's the brave person in me. Let's reframe that. But it's like, well, they don't like what I'm saying. I'm not in the right place. I need to go. That's my philosophy. And again, that's the anchoring of people like my parents and my dad. He always used to say to me, if you can't lay your head on the pillow at night, Syreeta, and sleep, then it's not, you should not be doing it. And so I've always carried these things in my head and I think, no, this isn't right, and if something's not right, I'm going to, nicely and diplomatically, but I'm going to do the work. Because what's the point? What's the point of getting to these positions and you're not doing the work and influencing and nothing bad happens? The thing is, nothing bad happens when it's the right thing. When you're setting tones of right and wrong, nothing bad happens. It's uncomfortable, but the right people and the right environment you will get the right outcomes. I 100% believe that. The wrong people in the wrong environments, you're not going to get the right outcomes, and you shouldn't be there. Regardless of the role you've got and the level you've achieved, you need to step out. And I've tried to kind of guide people who I talk to, mentor, coach, advise, to just be, and you mentioned it earlier, to trust yourself. You know, that takes a lot of trust in yourself, like, and a bit of dogmatic belief in what you're doing. And that's intentionality. Intentionality is not, I'm going to, have a beautiful home and I'm going to get this big job. That's not an intention. An intention, I think, is to live an authentic life and to do something that is purposeful and for the good of the rest and not just yourself.
And if you're going to do that, you need to be willing to take a risk.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting how much of you doing and creating spaces for other people has forced you to be a lot more or less risk averse. Because you're like, I'm doing this because I want to make a difference and make an impact. But then naturally I felt and then became part of your character, which is why we're talking about risk. And like for you, it's like, I'm there. I can lean into that curiosity. And I think it's a beautiful thing of when you do things with other people, that's the benefit you get from it. That's the impact it leaves, the imprint leaves on you. And that's why it's never a one-way thing. But something that you spoke about, which for me, people talk about representation a lot. And I was like, we have a lot of people who are figureheads. They're not representational. We have people who actually truly represent, and those are who are willing to take a risk. I think we have far too many people who are figureheads than those who actually represent, which is why change has felt a lot harder because you get to that position, it's like, oh, that's a risk. I don't want myself out there. So you have to recognize like, what is it you're willing to do? And bear in mind, like you said, you don't have to do it. Everyone has a choice to make. But you choosing to step into representation mode means that you're willing to take a risk. But the payoff is it makes a massive difference, not just to others, but to yourself as well. That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Representation happens behind the scenes. It is a back of house activity. It is not front of house. And you're absolutely right. I'm not going to be too cynical here, but you can do all the roundtables you like. You can have all the initiatives and campaigns and programs and events. But if the profile and the representation that you want to see at the most senior levels of government, organizations, community, construct, whatever the construct is, if that isn't happening, then that representation is not effective, right? Representation is not a job title. It's an action that you are taking. And it doesn't matter how little or how big, it's an action you are taking that is going to have a lasting, sustainable, and systemic effect. It's long-term. Representation has to be long-term. And I think a lot of us are doing very short-term activities at the moment that feel good in the moment, but are not going to help the next 2 generations coming up, because those systemic barriers are still there. The policies and processes are there. We're not penetrating critical positions in organizations. I'm going to talk organizations because that's the world I come from, but we're not penetrating critical positions, and critical positions are at every level. They're influencing positions. They make decisions on hiring people into the organization. They make decisions on evaluating performance and acceleration in an organization. They are the voice around the table that says person A is better than person B. If we're not in those rooms and in those positions, you can have as much awards and you can have as much dinners and roundtables as you like. That the status quo will continue to perpetuate. So I never really surfaced in my career until very late. My sister was very kind of, very vocal about me coming to the front, and she was right, because people need to see that you've done what you've done, Si. And I'm like, yeah, you're right, and she was right. But to your point, I've done the work, so I could step out at that point. And even when I did step out, everyone laughs. I'm not really a step out type person, because I'm like, there's work to do back here.
You're going to toe in there.
Yeah. I'm like, hi. I'll go outside the curtains, say hello, but there's work. there's scaffolding to build. There's the set to build. There's the production to create in order to present the show. And I think a lot of us see representation as the show, and it's not. It's the back of house activity. It's governance. It's, you know, how are we going to define business strategy? You know, what are the processes we're going to have in place to have equity in our company? You know, so that everybody has a chance, not just one group. Those roles are not front of house roles. They're in the background, and they are critical positions. And I think we need to start educating people in our community about that work, because it really matters. And it's where I'll come for the corporate brigade. You know, we need people on the buy and sell side. I think America's brilliant for this. And having worked in City, I've seen it. We're on both sides of the equation. We're in the buy side and the sell side. We're doing the entrepreneurial stuff. We're starting our own thing. We are in solo, you know, the gig economy. But we're also in these organizations in critical positions, influencing how funding happens and capital distribution happens and creating opportunities for entrepreneurs. We're in that part too in the States, but in the UK, we're not. And so I think we just have to make sure we're constantly looking at that equation and making sure people understand the opportunity on both sides.
I started a conversation before we started recording. I said that I've been looking forward to this conversation. And it's not often that you meet someone where other people's like, you need to meet Syreeta. Obviously we've met and done stuff in the past. But then to hear you really unpacking your journey, the way that you're approaching life, the conversation around identity and risk, for me, you really capture what representation is all about. Not just from the professional, but actually, here's what it looks like when I fully live out my life. As like from what you shared with your daughter, like you don't have to share that and put that out publicly, but for you, it goes back to, no, there's an element of stuff that we deal with.
Yeah.
And it's important that people know and learn from my experiences, learn from how to deal with or work with a child with autism, learn from the lessons that child has actually taught me to become a better person. Because a lot of times it's one way. No, it's like it's a two-way relationship. So there's so many elements around that you've been able to just put out into the world. And hearing you say like, you know what, I'm in that space where I'm curious now. I'm exploring what that means for me professionally. I'm enjoying it. It is scary, but I wouldn't have it in other ways. So I was like, you know what, and it's a great way to kind of live. And for me, it's a very good example that when I say what defines what leader is, you embody that in so many different ways. So thank you very much for just being open, being real, sharing, doing the work and having the receipts to back it up. But more importantly, really leading me to like, no, when I step into the fullness of who I am and I have the audacity to show up as myself and tap into joy, you can make things happen.
Yes.
And as coming full circle, as a woman, as a Black woman,
proud of it.
Those things are real, they're relevant, but they are not limits.
No.
The only limit is the one that you choose to put on yourself rather than what the environment can choose to put on you, and you are the epitome of that. So appreciate you for coming on.
Thank you, Sophie.
This is Everyday Leadership. We shall see you all next week.